Hey there, Margie Bryce here, bringing you the Crabby Pastor podcast. And I don't think you're going to be too surprised to know that it's too easy today to become the Crabby Pastor. Our time together will give you food for thought to help you be the ministry leader fully surrendered to God's purposes and living into whatever it takes to get you there and keep you there. So we're talking about sustainability in ministry. This is your host today of the Crabby Pastor podcast, and this is another conversation with Jay Whittmeyer, the executive director of the Lombard Mennonite Peace Center in Illinois, and he is here. We're going to talk about, I guess this goes under the heading of conflict, right? Triangles. You want to, this is not a geometry lesson, by the way, but this is a very useful tool to know and understand if you're a ministry leader, to when you're being triangled into something and how to manage yourself in the midst of that. So, Jay, I'm going to let you give us the tour here.
Well, we're always in triangles and we're part of triangles, and it's kind of the foundation to coalition building in life, it seems like. Let me talk a little bit from the Matthew 18 passage. That's often the way we introduce it into congregations. So Matthew 18 is if someone has a grievance against you or sins against you or commits an offense, if you will, then we're told when that person is alone, go to that person and talk to them and kind of work it out. Then if they don't listen, you bring 2 or 3 as witnesses and then take it to the church. And we know the passage. Often when someone does something, we're a little bit upset and we're reluctant to go speak to them directly and say, this didn't sit well with me and this is why. And often we need to build up our courage or something, but typically we come away a little upset, offended, and angry. And it might be the associate pastor is having difficult with the church secretary, say, whatever it is at church, because something didn't get done. It didn't get done again. And so that associate then immediately goes out and finds the youth director. And they go have lunch, and you won't believe what so-and-so did again, and begins to dump about the whole situation, the anxiety, the intensity, and spills it over. And pretty soon the youth director. So this is where the triangle is starting to form. And the youth director then has to make a choice about to kind of accept and jump into it. We do this so naturally, we don't even think about it. Or the youth director is going to step back and not get involved. So it can play out in a couple of different ways. So if the youth director begins to nod, they're in agreement and say, oh, she always does this. Just last week, she did this to me. And that sort of reinforcing agreement with the first person builds this triangle where the 2 of them, so the associate and the youth director, are in agreement. And the problem is that church secretary, however it plays out. And the 2 are on the inside of the triangle and they're in the know. And they'll do the work of analyzing the church secretary. Why does she do it? Well, it's probably because of this or that, or her lack of this or his lack of that. And they'll begin that diagnosis process and they'll be criticizing or commenting. And when they form this coalition, it's happening in the back scenes of the church. That church secretary, whatever staff member, will begin to feel that she is on the outside or he is on the outside, the secretary. So the 2 others will go to lunch and she doesn't get invited. They might have a meeting and something gets said and the 2 of them look at each other and maybe roll their eyes, but they have this shared secret communication. It's like us 2 against this one. And then the third one feels she's left out. She's not welcome. She doesn't participate. She doesn't fit in. And this will leave her feeling anxious about being on the outside. So when you're on the outside of a triangle and people go to lunch and they don't invite you, people make jokes and you feel like it's at your expense. They're not communicating properly. So you feel pretty upset about it. And the first thing you're going to do is go to the pastor and say, I was wondering what's going on here, because you're going to need to find someone else to partner up with, to confide in, to talk with, to just share the emotion and the feeling. And what you're basically doing is kind of dumping the anxiety of being left out of it and moving toward it. So it plays out in churches in that way, where you begin this private conversation. We're right, we're the good, they're wrong. And it begins to polarize the church, if you will. But it often comes down to a relationship. It might be the organist and the rector. It might be, the youth director and the pastor. It might be the clerk of session and the moderator, however the church polity is. They don't deal with the conflict and the tension in their relationship together. And so they feel the need to expand it further out. And that's how triangles form. And much of it is just to ease our own anxiety of being separate or being offended or being left out. And that's kind of the basis for it, if you will.
So if in those moments when you're upset about something and you share with a different person, that's always you're creating a triangle?
It's so hard at that point, and to think it through. Some people have to, I often find myself just thinking out loud, and I'm looking as a sounding board. And I'm not trying to build an us-them coalition. And I'm not trying to you do agree that she's this way, right? You're not trying to build that agreement. We all know that she's, you're trying to build that agreement. So you can kind of stay out of it and talk it through. But in the back of it, this is my strategy to, speak the truth in love, if you will. This is, I need to talk to her about it. And I'm thinking it through and I'm building my courage. But at that point, then you own it and you accept it, that it's my responsibility. It's not yours. I'm not looking for help here. I'm just talking it through, if you will. But it often doesn't go that way. The person has no intention or is looking for that person to kind of take up the cause and fight for you on your behalf, if you will.
So the problem really arises when it gets divisive.
Yes.
On purpose. Because, I encountered some things where one sister came to me and said, you need to talk to my sister because she lives a mile away from me and she won't pick me up to bring me to church. And so you need to go tell her to, and I thought, I'm not stepping into this. Are you kidding me? Oh my gosh. No, I didn't say that, but I was thinking that.
But that's a classic triangle.
It
you
is.
and me and my sister. And those are really hard to deal with. It can be, it can go to this far, say, let's call her right now and say, Leanne, I have your sister so-and-so here, and she's saying that there's some issues about getting you at church and asked me if I'd step in. I'd be glad to do it if you'd be more comfortable. And then you've got the three of you, and it becomes very transparent. And Bowen talks about the role of the clinical psychiatrist as detriangling the triangle. There might be a husband and wife, and the husband's going on, and he would turn to the wife and just say, you've just heard your husband talk about your work at home or talk about this or that. how would you respond to that? And then he's connecting to both equally at the time. And much of the work I see as a mediator is the ability to stay in equal communication and contact with both. And those private conversations, you say, well, is it okay if I share this with so-and-so, what you've just shared, and kind of take those secret, the gossipy stuff and bring it to light. Say, I'm glad to do it, but I'm going to share that you came to me and asked, would I pick her up? And that has a very different feel to it than just, sure, I'll do that, without telling her that the sister came and approached you in the first place. That would be
right. I had a friend that used to always say, secrets are bad, secrets are bad. And I used to laugh because I said, you almost sound like a parrot the way you're saying that. Secrets are bad, secrets are bad.
And for pastors, it's easy to get pulled in because, your first week and you deliver a sermon and someone will say, Pastor, your sermon was so good. We so enjoyed it. Our last minister was so dull. He just couldn't ever find anything good to say. And she'll say, oh, thank you. I'm glad to be here. But you've just got pulled right into that old pastor, new pastor triangle. It's just very subtle. As opposed to,
I wouldn't have thought
everybody
of that.
has different gifts and calling, and I'm sure others really enjoyed those sermons as well. But I'm glad you appreciated my sermon this week, but maybe next week, who knows? But, when you begin to agree and feel good, you got kind of pulled right into it.
I was, as you were talking there, I was just kind of thinking about, getting pulled in. And then you said, pastors, deal with this a lot. I mean, so it's helpful for us to be able to recognize what's going on and how to manage ourselves and how to manage the situation, yourself within that situation.
Well,
but we're fixers. Pastors are fixers anyway.
I know they come into that, right?
Yeah.
And then, like your example of the sister comes to you, so you're the minister. You can get triangled with anyone on the church council or church board, but you have members who have their own families. And now you could get triangled into any one of those families. Here's my sister. I want to bring a prayer request. And you begin to realize, oh, this is not a prayer request. I'm getting triangled into the situation with this other sister. You kind of get pulled in. So pastors have to, this is part of being a non-anxious presence, is I think of it as if you were a newspaper journalist. I think mediators are a little bit this way, where you're hearing both sides, but you're not responding emotionally. What gets said, you're not committing to or fighting against. You're just kind of noting what the individual is saying, how you're going to respond. You'll step back and think about it, but you have that unbiased, neutral position of I'm only here to hear it, and I'm gathering information at this point, but there's nothing emotional for you in it. You're not trying to be close friends or minister, whatever. So that kind of helps me at least try to stay out of triangles, but it's not easy, I guess.
Yeah. And triangles aren't always bad, or are they always bad?
No, I mean, we're always in relationship, and often two people will find that they'll greet each other and they'll sit, and then somehow the conversation begins to feel a little uncomfortable, like they don't have a lot in common. They're just sitting there. And this is what Bowen observed with the child, is that as the husband and wife had nothing to talk about, when they could just begin to talk about their child, their son or whatever, then that gave them, and then the tension, that awkward space between them dissipated, and they found kind of a new rallying point, if you will. And it was, we have to care for our children. I'm not saying that. This is this over concern, and so the two would focus on the child as kind of a project, if you will. and that ease the tension in the relationship. That's where the triangles are really dangerous. And if you're unable to find a way to come to a relationship with someone, often then it might be a comment on a third person that stimulates the conversation and brings you together. And that's where triangles begin to be more troublesome. That we don't have a basis together except for criticizing the pastor or criticizing the song leader, or boy, that sure went on long.
Yeah.
You go to the DMV and you're standing there and say, well, this is government work, isn't it? And now the two of you have formed a relationship based on that other, it's just some clerk at the DMV. That's kind of how we do it. Or, once again, so-and-so, your second sister, once again, she forgot to bring something to Thanksgiving. And then, as you tell that story, triangles get built and you
right. So can you paint a picture of when a triangle is a good thing?
Well, a 3-person relationships are good things. And that's more where you can have, this would be my preference in the situation. And you let others, and you can be a little less dependent upon what they say. So if someone says, I really think we should do the early morning Easter worship, and you feel the need to kind of jump in. The second person says that, yes, we should really do it. It'd be great. And you feel like, oh no. And then you say, no, I don't think we should do it this year. We had poor turnout last year. Let's not do it. So the ability to be in communication on kind of those goals, principles, sense of mission, objective, life of the church, and the three of you can talk equally and not feel like, oh, they're not going to like me if I don't agree. That's the part where the triangles become dangerous. You're anxious about the relationship, and so you're moving into an agreement mode to be part of it. So I think it'd be great if we could do it, but last year it wasn't a big success and I can't make it, so I'd rather not. So you kind of step out and put it on them. What are they going to do? So it's kind of that way. So being more open, more transparent, and less feeling the need that, my status in this relationship is jeopardized if I don't kind of agree and go along and get sucked in. So you stay out of it that way.
Yeah, this is somewhat too about how we stay connected, but then also stay true to ourselves and to, what we really think, what we really feel, and feel safe enough to share.
And Bowen said, he put a scale and he was saying people are different. And he said certain higher on the scale, as he defined it, are able to be in relationship with others without compromising their own principles and values. Further down on the scale, there was a lot of globby fusion, as he called it. And there it becomes very difficult to be your own person. The temptation to violate confidences, the temptation to not be professional, you get lost further down in the scale and you get sucked into triangles and you get focused on the relationship, how you fit, what people think of you, what you think of them, what will please them, what will anger them. And that becomes your world. Higher on the scale, it's more about moving on with life and mission and self-actualization and purpose. And you get less bogged down in kind of that drama, if you will.
Yeah, drama. There's lots of drama. And, I read somewhere too that the challenge today is that there's a lot of emotional immaturity and certainly things like, a 2-year plus shutdown. I mean, not that long ago, it was a few months ago, I think it was before, so it was just this past year that they waved the white flag, the World Health Organization, and said, okay, come out, everybody, it's over. But a few months before that, I was standing in line for something, and certainly we're pretty far on the other side anyway of COVID. And there was a couple of young women in front of my husband and I, and they were saying, "Oh, this is my first time out." And I thought, "Oh, wow. Okay." So they had done above and beyond. And to be fair, possibly they had a health situation or a
Sure.
family member with a health situation that warranted that kind of caution. But it certainly was an era where your anxiety was being routinely
Yeah.
fueled in trying to grapple and understand. And then you weren't getting clear direction a lot of times. And so people really, and then the isolation factor. I mean, how much has COVID impacted us in that way emotionally?
Yeah, I think it's been very significant. And if you move toward isolation and loneliness, and that's different than solitude. Isolation
Yeah,
and
yeah.
solitude are distinctly different. In fact, the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, I believe is his name, he wrote a book. I bought the book. I don't have it, forget the name, but he started a new national campaign, called it Epidemic Health Crisis, on loneliness and the dangers of loneliness. And we know that others who talk about loneliness, Capaccio, I think, is the name of the University of Chicago writer who writes on loneliness, but he says the more isolated you are, the more when you go into public settings, you become fearful and you become distrustful. So you begin going down this dangerous maelstrom, if you will, where it begins to exacerbate itself. So the more isolated you are, the more fearful you become, and the more paranoid you become of moving out into public space. But the Surgeon General has said it's like smoking a pack of cigarettes a day if you're lonely and isolated, that the impact it has on your personal physical health is really detrimental, and really calls on social institutions like churches to really reach out and really give people a sense of belonging and purpose. And I think for some churches who for decades could put on good worship, do have the music, have the Bible study, Christian ed, whatever that took, it was fine, but did not work at the intentionality of helping people feel a sense of belonging. Like, you're part of this group, we know who you are. And a lot of people got lost in the midst of COVID and didn't feel the need to come back, that they weren't quite connected to the church. Church was something you do on Sunday morning. It's really expected to do, but the emotional side, they didn't connect. I had one, we were doing a mediation at a church, and a man said, I came to realize when I was looking online through Zoom that I don't really care much about the Bible reading and the singing. It's the people I'm connected to. And, with the shutdown, I couldn't connect with them. So I just kind of lost track of the church. If I can't be with the people, then there's not the point. But churches responded in various ways, but that emotional connection was really a key component of it.
And then for churches, that emotional connection, that saying to other people, "You belong here." We say that because of our relationship with Christ, and we want to show that to other people. And I just read an article, and I think it was a blog, and I think I did put it in the Facebook group, Self-Care and Sustainability for Ministry Leaders, because it was a pretty eye-opening little read, that the problem for the church is that many people look at us and say, we don't believe what we say we believe. They're not seeing it in action. And this falls into what we're talking about with the emotional connection, because my husband and I, attend a very large church. And finally I said to him, I said, I got to go find some people. somewhere. I mean, I have friends and that kind of thing, and we got connected intentionally to a small group so that, we could have that kind of support, prayer support, and people that accept us and care
Yeah.
about us like Jesus would.
Yeah.
And that is a very powerful thing that
Yeah.
if churches really were to harness that in a very serious way and have their leadership come to understand, whether it's training on family systems or something where they understand the emotional connectivity speaks more than just emotional connection. There's a spiritual aspect to this as well that the church has to offer. That's a pretty potent.
I think it's really important. Preaching recently on the feet washing episode in John 13 or whatever, and in the middle of the meal, Jesus gets up and he's starting to wash Peter's feet, and Peter objects, you're not going to wash my feet. And Jesus says, well, if I don't wash your feet, you have no part in me. And I think that phrase, having a part, a sense of belonging, a chair at the table, if you will, that's how I think of it, a real sense of belonging with one another. I think is profoundly important, and to make people feel that we're not just putting on a Sunday service, if you will, that you come and watch. You might know a few people and say hello, but you really connect deeply with the church. As you said, we had to find a small group where people could really understand us. We could get to know them on a different level. I think family systems gives us a sense of why that's so important.
Yeah, and I guess I didn't realize it until we're chatting right now about why that was. I really did. I got a little rabid feeling about it. Post anxiety. I was like, I could connect to people, and I'm an introvert.
Yeah.
So that's a big statement when I'm going, I got to connect with people,
Yeah.
because I can do by myself, but there comes a point.
I don't think it's been a primary focus of churches in terms of programming. Our local church, my wife was on the board and felt like she didn't know people very well. And they started once a week, they would get together, and one person, the group's about 12, 15, would tell the story, their personal story, and not a testimony. It's more where I grew up, my family, how I ended up in this church and this part of my life, and if there was divorce or children, all that. And they circled through the group over the course of months. And many said, I've known you for 30, 40 years, but I never knew that about you, or I never knew this. Because there's no place in church to really have these deep personal conversations and to give it the context. And this is really important to be part of one another's lives, if you will. It's so fundamentally who we are as people and who we are as Christians that we use phrase like the congregation or a fellowship, that sense of being people together, worshiping God. The body of Christ is the one I particularly like. All of this is just anchored in systems thinking, or precedes systems thinking. And systems thinking describes what the church has known forever, that we're all connected.
Yes, I know. Isn't that's always fascinating to me when I see a scientific fact like that, and I go, oh, well, this has been in, part of scripture. I can't.
We've done this for a long time.
I know. We go, hey, we kind of know this already. And this is another one that we are gifts to one another, and we need to connect and understand what good, healthy connection looks like. And it is rough and tough when you get into triangle situation, because there usually is some kind of conflict where you have not gone directly to that individual and said, hey, that's courage. Courage is being afraid, but doing it anyway. Right. Yeah. And so, you want to, as they say, put your big girl panties on and go and have that conversation. And at the end of the day, you will feel better within yourself, within your soul even. And I know too that as you continue to stay connected, even with family of origin, even when things, there are situations where you need to back off and, there might be some bigger issues at play, but people tend to, North Americans, we're really good at cutoff. Look at what we did when we left England, and different we're out of here. We're going over there. Bye. And we're very,
There's
very good at cutoff. But I find that as you even just hang around with family of origin people, it does good things to your heart inside. I don't necessarily totally understand that, but it does good things for you, that you push back against the cutoff and try to stay connected. You don't want to be absorbed by another person or fused. You don't want that, but just at least if you can stay in some kind of connection is a good thing.
this is really an important point. A researcher out of Cornell named Carl Pillemer has done a lot of work on fractured families, he calls it. And he says that I think it's 27% of Americans have significant cutoff in their families. And he defines that as, so that's over 70 million Americans. I think he calls it fractured lives, fractured families, something. And it's exactly that, where there's it comes to a head. There's an ugly kind of a volcanic episode. Why do you always tell me to do this or that? And I'll never speak to you again. And one storms out, and 30 years later, they haven't spoken. And it's very common in America. I don't know. As you say, there's been a history of cutoff. That's how we all ended up here.
Mm-hmm.
But from a systems perspective, to bridge that cutoff with a brother or sister or parent can give you real, in a sense, stability or confidence in life. I mean, really anchored in the soul in such a way that can be a very hard conversation. You might have to set boundaries and do lots of things around the specific issues, but that's the hard conversation. And if you can have that conversation with a brother or sister or parent and bridge cutoff, then when it comes to having a voice in a church conflict, you just have a strength and a stability that's very different. So you become more confident. The opposite side of it is if you have a lot of cutoff and you need for that close, deep relationship with communication, if you don't have it in that family of origin, you might grab the first thing that comes and you might kind of fuse too deeply or too inappropriately with someone else or within the congregation. So it leaves you vulnerable. It kind of has an open wound that you kind of move toward. So it's just a very dangerous situation, but it's common. And the third thing I'd say about this is that if you have a history of cutoff in your family, that when criticism comes up in the church, it's not uncommon for the pastor to begin to distance himself, herself, and then maybe even move toward, okay, I'll leave the church. It's a little unpleasant. I'm gonna get out. And then, someone says something, someone does something, and the pastor resigns, and nobody quite knows why. And that's another example of a disproportionate response coming out of our family systems that carries over.
Yeah, it always goes back to your family of origin, doesn't it? I'm like, oh, not this again.
Yeah.
You think you've whatever.
Grow out of it or
Yeah.
be redeemed out of it. But God is sanctifying us along all these lines, I believe. So we are growing in the faith and the nurturing.
Well, I know we've covered a lot of ground here, but this just maybe gives people a taste of some of the tools that could be of help for you individually as a leader, and then also help you understand some of the dynamics with the people that you are called to lead. And we will have information about the Lombard Mennonite Peace Center in the show notes again. And I took some notes about some of these books that Jay mentioned. if you're that interested, you could connect with Lombard. I know they provide workshops, and you can work on growing yourself up, as they say. And it's a big job, but it is also a part of leadership. And the first step of leadership is being able to lead yourself well, so that you can step into and be the person that God has called you to be in the places that God has planted your feet. So check out the show notes, and thanks for listening, and don't become the crabby pastor.
Thank you so much.
Sure. The Crabby Pastor podcast is brought to you by Bryce Coaching, and I connect with ministry leaders and help them when they are stuck, help them when they need to know what their next steps are, and just a journey with them, which is a type of self-care, actually. But this podcast is also brought to you by Bryce Glass Art. You can find that on Facebook. So when I am doing this podcast, it is paid for and sponsored by the glass articles that I make and sell, and the coaching that I do. And it is my privilege to call you to radical self-care so that you can go the distance with God. Hey, thanks for listening. It is my deep desire and passion to champion issues of sustainability in ministry and for your life. So I'm here to help. I stepped back from pastoral ministry, and I feel called to help ministry leaders create and cultivate sustainability in their lives so that they can go the distance with God and whatever plans that God has for you. I would love to help. I would consider it an honor. And in all things, make sure you connect to these sustainability practices, so that you don't become the crabby pastor.